Pam Bondi wasn't the type to quietly accept punishment. She thrived on pushing the boundaries of the law. Courtroom 3B in Tampa had been her battleground for years, a familiar stage where she'd honed her craft. On that humid Florida morning, March the 27th, 2025, she arrived early, her heels clicking against the marble steps of the courthouse. She'd finished her coffee in the car, her briefcase heavy with notes she'd reviewed the night before. The day seemed routine, a minor hearing, a quick procedural matter, nothing to disrupt her schedule. But when she was slapped with an unexpected $110,000 fine, she didn't flinch. She struck back with such precision that even the judge began to question his ruling. This wasn't just a case, it was a test of wills, and Pam knew it. The courthouse loomed under a gray Tampa sky, its aging facade reflecting decades of legal battles. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and musty paper, a testament to the building's history. Pam settled at the defendant's table, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. She flipped through her notes, more out of habit than necessity. Every argument, every precedent was already etched in her memory. Across the room sat James Harrow, the city attorney, a young man with a nervous energy. He adjusted his tie repeatedly, shifting in his chair as if the wooden seat burned him. Pam caught his eye once, offering a faint smile. His unease was palpable, a prelude to the storm neither he nor anyone else saw coming. The case was supposed to be straightforward. A minor dispute over a local ordinance, a clerical hiccup meant to be resolved in 10 minutes. Pam had handled dozens like it, her reputation as a relentless litigator preceding her. But as the clock ticked past 9 a.m., her instincts tingled. Something felt off. At 9:03, the heavy door creaked open, and Judge Raymond Dalton strode in. Tall, with a graying beard and eyes that pierced like steel, he carried an aura of unyielding authority. His 30-year tenure on the bench had made him a fixture in Tampa's legal circles, a man who ruled with an iron hand and brooked no dissent. His robe rustled as he took his seat, his presence silencing the room. Most judges pause to review files, acknowledge the attorneys, ease into the day. Not Dalton. "Let's get right to it," he said, his voice flat but commanding. Pam straightened slightly, sensing a shift. Dalton didn't glance at the docket. "The court has reviewed the matter," he continued, "and finds the defendant in violation of Local Statute 14B. She is fined $110,000, payable immediately." The words landed like a gavel strike. Silence enveloped the room. Pam's brow lifted just a fraction, but her face remained a mask of calm. Inside, her mind raced. She'd anticipated a discussion, perhaps a reprimand, not a summary judgment without a whisper of debate. Harrow glanced at her, his expression almost apologetic. Even he hadn't expected this swift hammer. Pam folded her hands deliberately, her voice steady. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I haven't presented my arguments." Dalton didn't blink. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear." Pam studied him. This wasn't just a ruling. It was a statement, a flex of power. Dalton's deep-set eyes held more than judicial resolve. They carried a personal edge, as if he'd been waiting for this moment to put her in her place. She'd faced him before, knew his reputation. A judge who'd once overturned a city council decision single-handedly, a man who saw challenges as affronts. Her voice stayed firm. "If the law were that clear, Your Honor, we wouldn't be here. I request the opportunity to present my defense. Dalton leaned back, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You're welcome to try, Miss Bondi, but the outcome won't change. That sealed it. This was about her, about testing her resolve. She adjusted her papers, a theatrical gesture. She didn't need them. The fine wasn't the stakes. Principle was. She'd fought bigger battles, taken on corrupt officials, stared down threats. This question mark, this was personal. Meeting Dalton's gaze head on, she said, then I suppose we should get started. Tension thickened the air. Harrow shifted again. The stenographer repositioned her chair, and a handful of spectators, lawyers and clerks awaiting their cases, leaned forward. Dalton thought he held the reins, but Pam knew better. This wouldn't be the quick victory he envisioned. Raising her hand, she paused, letting silence amplify her presence. She didn't rush or falter. Turning a page for effect, she faced Dalton. Your Honor, before I proceed, let's clarify something, she said, her voice unwavering. Are you saying the defense has no right to argue in a legal proceeding? Dalton's expression stayed stone cold. I'm saying the violation is clear and the fine stands. Pam tilted her head, assessing him. Interesting. In all my years of practice, I've never met a judge who dismissed a defense. Unheard, what's the phrase, unprecedented. Dalton's jaw tightened. She'd struck a nerve, not by attacking, but by forcing him to justify himself. He exhaled slowly. Miss Bondi, this court isn't for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands. Pam's lips curved into a knowing smile. He'd opened the door. Ignoring her papers, she locked eyes with him. Very well. Let's discuss Local Statute 14B, the one I've allegedly violated. She tapped the document. You say it's clear, but it's been challenged repeatedly over the past 5 years. Dalton's eyes narrowed. Subsection C, for instance, she continued, her tone conversational yet cutting, is so vague it's been deemed unenforceable in at least 3 cases. And last year, an appellate ruling held that fines under this statute, without due process, violate constitutional protections. The room fell silent. Pam felt the shift. Dalton did too. He straightened, his voice sharpening. Those cases don't apply here. She didn't hesitate. Don't they? The Reynolds versus City of Clearwater ruling states an administrative fine without evidence is reversible on procedural grounds. She paused, then added, I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't ignore precedent. Dalton's jaw clenched. Are you threatening an appeal, Miss Bondi? She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. I don't threaten, Your Honor. I cite the law. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. She'd turned the tables, making Dalton defend his stance. Harrow cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton cut him off with a raised hand, his gaze fixed on Pam. After a long pause, he said, Very well. Present your defense. Pam smiled faintly. This was just the start. But as she prepared to speak, Dalton leaned forward, fingers laced, his voice a warning. Proceed. She recognized the tactic. This was about control, not justice. He wanted her to know her place. She wouldn't bend. Standing taller, her face unreadable, she began. Let's start with the statute itself. 14B claims non-compliance warrants a fine, but compliance is undefined, broad, vague, and at odds with due process. Dalton exhaled, unimpressed. Yet this statute has been enforced repeatedly. Pam tilted her head. Has it? Public records show 4 dismissals due to that vagueness. She glanced at Harrow, then Dalton. Unless due process is optional? Dalton's grip tightened on the bench. If your argument rests on procedural quibbles, reconsider. The law stands as written. Pam paused, then said, except when it doesn't. Murmurs rose again. She held up a document. Take Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. Same statute, same method. The appellate court ruled the city's interpretation breached state protections. The judge said it lacks clear notice and standards, rendering it unenforceable. Dalton's face stayed blank, but his tension was evident. Harrow interjected, we're veering off. Pam cut him off. Counselor, reconcile Henderson with this fine. If you've got a counter, I'm listening. Harrow faltered. She turned to Dalton. I'm not asking for favors, Your Honor. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court found this statute flawed, how does this fine hold? Dalton sat back, calculating. That case isn't identical, he said. Pam didn't blink. True, but the precedent applies. It's not a technicality. It's the core of enforcement. Ignoring it breaks the law. Dalton's fingers tapped. A rare tell. This court knows Henderson, he snapped. Judicial discretion interprets specifics. Pam smiled faintly. Discretion, not fabrication. No evidence, no process. Pure Henderson. She let it sink in. Does this court override appellate rulings? I'd love to hear that. Murmurs grew. Harrow's confidence faded. Dalton didn't reply immediately. Pam had him. Let's examine enforcement, she said. I call Officer Calloway. The officer approached, swore in, and sat. Pam walked over slowly. You issued this violation? Yes, ma'am. On what basis? The statute's clear. The property didn't comply. I documented it and fined her. Pam clasped her hands. Photographs? Calloway hesitated. No, ma'am, wasn't necessary. She smiled. No documentation, yet you fined me? He shifted. My experience identifies violations. No photo needed. Pam turned to the bench. Your Honor, no photos, no statements, no proof, just subjective judgment. That defies appellate standards. Dalton sat back, knowing she was right. So how does this court justify this fine? Silence reigned. Dalton drummed his fingers. He'd expected Whitaker's presence to corner her, but she'd turned it against him. Recess, he barked. Pam held her smile. She wasn't done. Dalton was rattled. He'd risen through Tampa's courts with a reputation for crushing dissent, once jailing a defiant attorney for contempt over a minor quibble. Losing wasn't in his playbook. When they reconvened, his demeanor had hardened. Whitaker sat silently, reserved. Miss Bondi, your arguments are compelling, Dalton said, voice tight. He hated concessions. But the issue remains. The fine stands. Pam blinked. He was digging in. She nodded slowly, then turned to the stenographer. Read the last statement. The fine stands, came the reply. Pam faced Dalton. So, on record, a fine without evidence contradicts precedent? Dalton's fingers twitched. This court has discretion. Pam cut in, smiling. Discretion, not immunity. She stepped closer. If this holds, any officer can fine on a whim. No proof, just words. She turned to the gallery. Imagine, a business fined for nothing provable, a homeowner penalized without recourse. That's not discretion, it's unchecked power. Whitaker spoke. Does this undermine due process? Pam nodded. And judicial integrity, rulings on assertion, not evidence, erode the system. Dalton's grip tightened. He was trapped. Harrow tried. Your Honor. Dalton silenced him, frustration clear. After an eternity, Dalton exhaled. The fine doesn't meet evidentiary thresholds. It's overturned. His voice was stiff. The gavel fell. Pam nodded politely, no gloating. She gathered her papers as murmurs spread. At the exit, Dalton called, "Miss Bondi." She turned. "I underestimated you." She smiled. "You're not the first." She left, heels echoing. This case would echo beyond these walls, a warning to judges who assumed absolute power. In the marble hallway, Pam's pace was steady, her mind sharp. She'd expected routine. She'd gotten a war of law and ego, and won. But Dalton wouldn't forget. As she neared the exit, Whitaker approached. "Something on your mind, Judge?" He studied her. "You're good." "I try," she said. He lowered his voice. "I wasn't here to watch. I was here to contain." Pam raised an eyebrow. "Contain what?" "Dalton hates losing. This was about making an example." She'd sensed it. "And now?" Whitaker's look mixed respect and caution. "They'll watch you. Beyond here." She nodded. "Thanks for the heads up." He stepped back. Pam pushed the doors open, sunlight hitting her face. The air felt lighter. This wasn't her first fight, nor her last. Power wasn't the bench, the robe, or the title. It was knowing the rules and daring to challenge them.